Hi, everybody. Welcome to the second episode of Progress Over Perfection. I'm Jack Moore, once again, managing partner and co-owner of Evans Inc. Last episode, Shoshana and I dug into what happens when you're stuck waiting for perfect information. The short version, the result, what we talked about was 70% confidence is enough to move. So if you missed that episode, please go back and give it a listen. Today, we're going to get more specific. So what happens when you inherit or you're a consultant on a federal program that's already in motion and nobody handed you the keys? The last PM left, maybe the documentation's a mess, the team's trying to figure out who you are as a leader. Are you going to actually lead, or are you just going to schedule a ton of meetings? So I'll be honest with you, as I was in the last episode, I've definitely been on the wrong side of this. I've walked into situations where I spent the whole week pretending to listen and learn, and the team, like a week later, was like, they trusted me less because they didn't think I was really going to be doing anything. I wasn't taking any action. So it turns out they thought that doing nothing looks a lot like I didn't care. So definitely not going to prescribe that. But anyway, so this matters right now because last year was a big turnover year in the federal government. Agencies saw like over 300,000 separations against around 70,000 hires. And that is it creates a massive continuity gap. So people are stepping into this situation a lot more frequently where they're got promoted, maybe they're taking over a program that hasn't been theirs, and they're like, heck, what do I do from, here? So and no one, of course, with the pace that's being expected is giving them grace to figure it out. So I've brought in somebody who's done this a lot, and I'd say Bob has done this a lot more recently than I have. And honestly, I think he's become a lot better at it than I ever was, and I think is looked at by his clients to do it in a way that's it's pretty amazing. So Bob Etris, who's joining me here, is my business partner and fellow co-owner at Evans. Bob started his career at Evans as a business analyst and has built his career through helping organizations move through change, helping some of our big clients through massive lifecycle acquisitions, and generally being helping our clients with improve their program delivery. So he's definitely walked into a lot more messy handoffs than either of us can count on. And really made them move. So, Bob, I want to welcome you to Progress Over Perfection.
Thanks. I appreciate the kind intro. Made me sound more like a professional white collar SWAT team member almost. I got to figure out how to get that on the business card.
Yeah, you definitely should. But go right along with like my Six Sigma thing that used to be there.
Yeah. But no, this will be a lot of fun. Looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, likewise. So, before we start talking playbook, let's step back for a second. So I know when you and I started working together, you kind of were brought into a big program, and they had lots of different, I'll say, tentacles and brought into a lot of different programs midstream. So what did that feel like when you got brought into that situation? Like it looked like probably like the first time versus where it eventually fell.
Honest answer, equal parts thrilling and terrifying, probably, right? Like when you're at a point in your career, and I think when you're, whether in government contracting, right, or a lot of our program manager, right, career federal employee customers, the first time an SES level director or executive taps you and says, hey, I was told this is my number one priority, whether it's a $10 million program or a $10 billion program, when they're basically saying like, you're going to come fix this with me, here we go. It's like, wow, okay. Like that's a bright light that's shining on me now, kind of 24/7. Awesome. This will be a great experience. They have this trust in me that I didn't know was there. And then flip side is kind of like, oh boy, you just start thinking about the practical sense of like, what is the pace of work and life and everything? How do you balance things and kind of keep up? And then you just start processing, at least I started processing. There are so many known unknowns ahead.
Mm.
What should I be thinking about to prepare myself mentally for how I can start to compartmentalize things and the like. So there's I don't know, it's almost like sort of this like psychological readiness thing that just started kind of processing right over the course of those first few days, which I know we're going to talk a lot more about, but it's but yeah, and I guess the other piece is, reacting to things that are, those moments are rarely planned or things you can anticipate.
Right.
It's just like you're having a day, feels pretty normal, and then something drastically new and different kind of starts. So
yeah, they do seem to, like, a lot of them kind of, another example I'm going to talk about later is come out of left field, right? Oh, hey, you're good at this, or
yeah,
you did a pretty good job on this before. Can you come help me with this? And it's a less of a good situation. So yeah,
yeah.
I get that.
I mean, the specific scenario I remember was, just to put a tiny bit of color to it, I got a phone call late in the day, call it like 6 p.m. from this executive who almost never called. And if they were to call, it was rarely because things were going exceptionally well or they just wanted to
Right.
catch up. So I pick up the phone and they go, Etris, I'm out here. They were at a facility on the West Coast. I'm out here. We're talking through stuff. This whiteboard is covered with process flows. I have no idea what's going on. I don't know what else you're doing, but like clear the calendar next week because you're coming out here and we need to get started on figuring this out. So like that was
Wow.
the actual conversation. And then he hung up. There was like no pleasantries, no nothing. There was no way I was in a position to travel that following week on paper. And I was like, okay, we're going to make this happen.
Yeah, it's like it is interesting how there's, people know things aren't going well, but then all of a sudden there's a massive urgency. Okay, we gotta fix this. I know
Yep.
you worked on some where it was like almost, I won't say formulaic, but it was like like we got to put together a get healthy plan for this thing. And I remember you becoming the get healthy, get programs healthy guy. So
Yep.
so as you got into it, right? So I don't want to speak for you, but like I would imagine on one of your early programs where you did this, you developed a rhythm to it. And I don't know if it reached the point where you felt like you had a playbook, but what, as you kind of figured out and got over the exciting and terrifying element of it, what became your approach to these types of situations? What are you trying to get done, I guess, specifically in the first 48 hours?
Yeah. Yeah. I think there's a way to think about it, whether you want to call it a playbook or an approach. But I think for me, there are certain core attributes that go into a repeatable type process that are useful in my experience. So one is whether it's me and the role that I have or making sure. So let's imagine two different entry points into this scenario. It's either a new leader who's being introduced to a piece of work I'm already involved in, and I know direction from their leadership is make this person successful. Not to suggest it's my job alone, or you're kind of dropped in to something brand new, either with existing leadership that's struggling or new leadership. So for me, step one is just getting super clear on making sure that the communication related to whatever change in roles is happening is clearly understood by all the right people, right? Like, is this person on a 6-month detail? Is this person, no kidding, now in charge? And whether they're on a detail or they're permanent doesn't matter. Are they just here in like some kind of advisory capacity for a period of time? Because I feel like, when it comes to like leadership and responsibility and accountability and authority, when those things get muddled, you lose time and it costs money, right? Because people don't know who to go to and how decisions are made. And if that's clear for the team, when you're typically talking about, in the hundreds between feds and contractors, that won't work. So first thing is just clarity. Second thing, kind of in the theme of clarity, but a variant of it, I think, getting as much information as you can on who's doing what, like, and not just like an org chart. Org charts are useful as a reference point, but getting the people who understand how things actually work on the program, like who does what, right? Like who's the go-to for the key things, and having no kidding conversations about where are the personnel problems on the program, and what needs to be done to address them. Third thing is going more, I'll say broadly, on understanding the dollars and people makeup of the program.
Mm.
Because you got to, right, like, you got to know, no kidding, know the budget, know where the financial challenges are, know where the personnel needs are, both in terms of shortages and kind of relating to the people problems thing that I mentioned. Also know, like, who are the influencers, right? Like, who are the, people talk about stakeholder engagement, stakeholder management. A lot of that's just understanding how you can determine, like, where are your allies and where are the people that you need to spend more time with. Fourth thing for me is, again, plain English, like, don't sugarcoat a conversation on what are the real, no kidding, issues in the next 30 days that need immediate attention, and are people working on those or not, and where are we at with those, and what needs to be done to make sure it's successful. I feel like it's human nature when a new leader entity is introduced, people are hesitant to raise bad news,
Yeah, they want to leave
or
the
they want to,
skeletons in the closet, right?
right? You don't want to, like, you kind of want to feel them out because you don't want them to be annoyed, but you're also assuming they're overwhelmed and you don't want to add more to their plate. And right, we all have those voice tracks that just run in our head.
Right.
Unfortunately, those voice tracks aren't helpful. So you have to ask the question to create the space for them to give the information that you need. And then the fifth one, the last one that comes to mind for me, is kind of the flip side of that last coin. Let's call it 90 days from now or 6 months from now. What's the stuff over the horizon, without going through the schedule and backlog and stuff? What's the stuff over the horizon that we're worried as a team that we are already behind schedule on, even though it's not a next week problem or a next month problem, but it will be a, no kidding, like, we're going to drive off a cliff if we don't figure out how to get this thing back on track, right? And whether, again, that's critical path or some sort of an approval thing or some sort of a authorization, etc. Because those are the things that can be hiding until they're not anymore, right? And you
Right.
run into this invisible brick wall you weren't expected to see. So it doesn't have to be in that sequence, but there's some variant of those elements that come to mind for me.
Yeah. So it does sound, I mean, it sounds like I don't know if you've read, like the 90-day plan that, this
Yep.
book that I even have given that to a couple of my clients, like, that were taking on new roles. And I don't know, it's not out of, I don't know, like it feels like it would probably still work, but I think it's written in a way that doesn't take into account, like, the current environment we're in, right? Where things just,
Yeah.
I mean, like, not only how the federal government's being expected to work at a faster pace, but just everything needs to happen more quickly. And it sounds like you basically start, like, gathering a bunch of information and triaging what needs to be done in that first 30-day period where, what's coming around then over the horizon. Made a lot of sense for, like, a 90-day. So who are how do you approach deciding, like, who you want to talk to? In those initial conversations, like, it's, like, I would imagine, because you and I have talked a lot about ourselves as leaders, being confident that we can make a decision with 80 or even 70% of the information and moving forward. But how are you establishing, deciding who to talk to and working to establish trust with that core group of either team members or stakeholders?
Yeah. Great question. So a few things come to mind. One is, certainly you got to talk to, as early as possible, the people. Even though I referenced the org chart and some of its shortcomings, you do have to make sure you understand the folks that are in various lead roles on that
Mm-hmm.
org chart. Like, where are they at? What are they doing? What are their teams focused on? Right? Because that's, you're walking into a situation where, whether it's ideal or not, like, that's your team. So there's an element of creating a foundational understanding of those people and their backgrounds, building those relationships, etc. Related to that, but certainly independent of the org chart, I think it's critical to work your own human network in that
Right.
organization, to reach out to the people that you trust. And when I say trust, I mean, like, the people that you will, text jokes with, right, over the
Right.
weekend, the people that you've worked with for a long time, the people that if you called them and said you need something, that they would be there for you, right? So, and trying to map, like, okay, who's on that list that I feel like might know some of the people on this thing that I've been tossed into, and just start working the phones and be like, hey, this is what I'm involved in now. This is what I've been asked to do. This is kind of the landscape as I see it. Have you worked with these folks before? What has been your experience? What are their strengths and weaknesses? Like, what should I know about them? Are there undercurrents of, people have like history with each other or cultures that clash across lines of business? And that stuff doesn't jump out unless you talk to people, because no
Right.
one's going to get into a briefing for like a program review and say that one of their risks is that literally like Sally can't stand Jeff and they've been fighting for weeks and that's why we're 4 weeks behind schedule.
Right.
Like you don't see that bullet in a risk register, but people will
No.
talk about it, right? So I think you really just got to probe and ask, because that way you can start to get a gut feel on like, who can I lean on and rely on and trust out of the gate, because I know people that I trust who trust them, so I'll extend that until proven wrong. And then who are the people I need to win over or need more support, or
Yeah.
maybe haven't been positioned for success in the right way to date. So like, I think it's really useful to assume out of the gate, like no one's trying to do a bad job. No one wants to wake up every day. Well, almost no one, let's assume, wants to wake up every day and think, you know what? I want to go to work and make everything hard for everyone
Right.
that I interact with, because that's my passion. Most people like got the job they have because they believe in the mission on some level.
Yeah.
So I think, any leader's job in those early weeks is just to, all right, identify the perceived underperformers and see what you can do to help them, while at the same time leaning on, I'll call it the accelerators that you're going to need to really drive success.
Yeah. That reminds me of a program I actually started it. It was not a federal sector program; it was private sector, but it was in a large company that acted. It was a lot like a federal agency, as I found out, and I had my list of people, and I was doing like sort of a change readiness, but like who were champions versus who were going to be those people, as you
Mm-hmm.
said, like did you have to win over, and made I don't know, it was a little. I made a choice that I was going to meet with the people I needed to win over twice as frequently as the stakeholders that I felt like were already bought into the program that we were building. And it ended up, at least in that case, working over well, because like, what I found is that a lot of the people that needed to be won over maybe they hadn't had somebody spend a lot of time with understanding what the program was trying to accomplish, and listening to them about their concerns about how it was going to impact their team and their processes and whatnot. And it just seemed like that was a lesson I carried forward, when I started Evans working with you. And it seemed to, some of these bigger programs work pretty well, just to keep that list of like who's where on the spectrum of champion to really resist it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Now, I don't want to take you off script, but that reminds me of a short story, I promise,
Yeah,
that totally resonates with that. So, but your podcast, you're in charge. So, tell me if I go too long.
I'm happy
Um,
to listen.
uh, so one of my favorite examples that really speaks to the core, I think, of just what you were describing, like spending more time with the squeaky wheels, like the challenging ones, and how critical that is. So goes back to that earliest example of the executive who called me, Etris, I need your help. You're flying out next week, right? So let's say we're 4, 5, 6 months into that gig. And one of the things I was spending the most time on, and had been asked to quote unquote fix and help with, was this massive exercise to define a set of requirements to enhance this massive system that's used by thousands of air traffic controllers for the next 3 years.
Mm.
And let's say that they were 4 months into this requirements activity, they had a month left, and no one had confidence that it was going to get done on time, or something to that effect. And so I got involved, started working with the people who were leading it, like trying to build those relationships. And I could tell the one individual who was essentially the lead of this entire activity could not stand me.
Oh,
And I tried all of my tricks. Like I tried humor, I tried doing stuff for them before they asked. I tried suggesting like we get coffee or show up early. Like, what can I do to help? And felt like I was being avoided, canceled meetings, not being included in stuff. And that's tricky when, right, the executive who called me is sort of like, how is this going? And I'm like, in my head, I'm like, it's going really poorly. Like they're
yeah.
just they're doing their thing, and I cannot break through the Fort Knox of this team.
Right.
So there was one day, this is near the end of the story, I promise. There was one day we were walking from headquarters to this offsite facility where they were having a group of 40 people, right? It's supposed to be like one of the final ones to get these things set. And we were chatting, and finally I just said, "Hey, insert person's name. I feel like this isn't landing the right way, but I just want you to know, like, I just want the work to be successful. Like, I'm not here to do just what like your boss said or what your boss's boss said. And I get the distinct sense you don't think I'm needed, and that's totally fine. But they asked that I come help this make successful. And I'm here to help you be successful. I'll do whatever you think makes sense."
Yeah.
And somehow that opened the door of like, I'm so glad you said that, because I can't, and he just went on this tirade. I can't stand my boss and the guy in charge who asked you to get involved. I don't need his help. And like, I can't. And so we kind of commiserated over his frustrations. And then somehow once he was able to vent those things, we were totally cool ever since then.
Yeah.
So my only point in that story is it's like you were describing, spending time with those people. It takes time to find the angle, right? To get some
Right.
common ground that you can really work from.
Yeah. And I was actually going to bring that up because I think, times, I would imagine you've been through this as well, where there are times where, you're being asked on some level to do somebody else's bidding, and they've told you what they think the situation is, and you go in and there's generally, things aren't going well, but when you dig into the specifics, it's a little different than what they had told you. And having to differentiate that, like, okay, I'm, as a consultant in most of these cases you and I are talking about, I am being asked to do something by this person who's paying the bills. And then I go into the situation, somebody who doesn't necessarily, to your point, want me there, and realize that the environment's a little different than, the person paying the bills is the situation they'd laid out for you. And navigating that is like another nuance of this, because I mean, at the end of I love where you landed, because at the end of the day, the boss is the person's boss, and that, in your example, that, the person you're working with closely, they both want the program to succeed.
Yep.
And so like some of the details don't really matter. But I remember being in situations where I had to go back and like, hey, here's what I found. I did my little diagnostic or whatever. And, like you were right, that communication was an issue, or the people on the team don't really know, like they're on the same bus, but they don't know where they're going or whatever. But I also found that this seems to be working well. And typically the response is, okay, good.
Yep.
And then you move forward.
Yeah.
So I hopefully that resonates with you.
It does. It does. Absolutely.
All right. So let's get a little bit into, okay, so you've been there, whatever the time frame, like a week or ish, but it might be, long enough to realize that people have different ways of expressing urgency. And so how do you, and we even talk about this in our company, right? There's sometimes something sounds urgent because a couple people are talking about it loudly versus something that's we really need to work on. How do you start to distinguish that if you're going to a program and you hear a couple loud voices about one thing and you're just not really sure is that really the, as you said it, is it really on the no kidding, I got to get done in 30 days list?
Yeah. Yeah. I distinguishing between perceived urgency and important things that require attention is critical. And because also urgency, and a lot of times, is completely relative to the perspective of the person raising the topic, right? What's urgent for a senior systems engineer working on the design of a spec for a thing with a release date that's hurtling towards them, right, at light speed, very different than what's considered urgent for the chief operating officer of a 60,000 person agency who's about to go brief the Hill. So I think, one thing to really understand urgency well, you have to define it for people in the moment. And I don't mean dictate to them what it means. I mean, you have to kind of ask questions to understand what they really mean by that. And to do that successfully, I think you have to spend time really trying to understand both sort of laterally with other programs like situational awareness of what's in the portfolio, but then also vertically in terms of priorities of those above you and those below you on the org chart.
Right.
At the working level, because urgency changes, right? Like daily,
Yeah.
weekly, monthly, particularly in this environment with how government is run. So one is just having a clear definition of what's urgent. And I think the second thing is asking lots of questions to understand, well, okay, so if this happens, if this urgent thing you're describing is not resolved, what's the impact?
Right.
And I have found the impact statement will often start like fairly loftily and kind of in the abstract. It's like, well, if we don't get funding by this date, this milestone 9 months from now is blown, to use that as an example. And my mind immediately goes to, is it though?
You're right.
Like, is it that binary? If you don't get a couple $1 million by Friday, something 9 months from now is so irreconcilable, like the milestone's blown. I bet we can sit down and talk this through a little bit and figure out other ways to like work around that. Or if you don't get this funding, like what other things can we like hedge and move other resources around, et cetera.
Right.
So a lot of, especially on much larger scale government programs, I'm not saying that's not an important issue to resolve, right? But you got to understand, does it need to be we all got to drop everything to make sure this funding authorization happens by Friday? Should that be our singular focus, or can we work it in another way? So in those moments, I think, people just need like a thought partner, right? Because I feel like sometimes urgent issues being raised is almost a metaphor for, you're not paying attention to me. And I feel like the only way to get anyone's attention to get a decision made is I have to make this sound more urgent than maybe it actually is. Like if we were sitting in a bar or a coffee shop and I was like, hey, like for real, how urgent is this? And they're like, yeah, but I needed to get a meeting on it, So that's one way to get it in, I suppose.
Yeah. Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. It's really relative. I remember, situations where, someone would say like, oh, this is, it's short term or it's a medium term or long term. And then I'd realize that their medium term was like a week. Their short term was like a day versus somebody else was telling me like, oh, well, no, it's short term's in the next 30 days. Medium term is 6 months. And, these huge programs that we work on, can be years down the road, right? It's so long term. And so it's important to understand that. So I'm going to take a little bit of a right turn just to keep us moving. And wanted to share a story with you and get, that I ran into and kind of get your reaction. And, we can describe, what, like I'll share my lesson learned within it. But, so like early in my career, and and this was at Evans where we worked, not somewhere else. I was asked to kind of get launched into, like you're describing this. Okay, there's this program that's over in this other part of the agency, and we've kind of decided we need to take it over in the enterprise PMO, right? So this other directorate was running it, or division, and okay, we're going to bring it under our, umbrella, and we're going to put, they're not really running it like a good program should be run, and so they're, from that program's perspective, and they had their own PM when they had to go work under the enterprise PMO PM, they felt like they'd been punished. Okay, so you're telling me I wasn't doing a good enough job. I seem to have, I feel like it's going well, but all of a sudden I'm being told that I'm not running the program correctly. And in this case, it was interesting because they kind of weren't. It was hard, right? So I basically was put in a situation where it's like the documentation was a little bit of a mess. They were relatively early in the program lifecycle, but it was clear they didn't really have a compelling business case. Like they knew because it was something in their environment that this thing wasn't working, but they hadn't put the dollars and cents behind it and the benefit case and the gap analysis, whatnot. So I went in, I was like, all right. And I didn't really know much about what they did or whatever. And I just said, like, kind of like you said, I've got to meet with all the different stakeholders here, both get to know the person who's going to run it from the PMO side and get to know that prior PM their stakeholders and whatnot, and sort of realize there's a battle on the horizon and start just trying to help navigate that. And quite frankly, that was a battle that lasted the length of this program. But I needed to, I said, all right, look, you've got to go in front of the Resources Council in the next 2 weeks. I need to help you make this case. Let's start with that, right? So I focused on a deliverable they needed to get the funding to then move forward, right? Because under the PMO model, they needed to go through that gate. And I think that helped, similar to what you were describing in this challenging situation with your client. Like, I'm on your side,
right?
I know you're not happy that your program's been pulled in the PMO, and you're not probably super happy that I'm here, but I'm actually just trying to help, right? And let's work together. What do you have? And it turns out, once I asked, they had more documentation. They had like good information, like, oh, well, you need to go talk to so-and-so. He understands the dollars and cents behind this. And, he can help you do this, and this woman can help you do this. And it, was, I think they understood, my perspective in a way that was valuable to start to build some trust. And by the end of that week, we had, I'd say it was a week, but we built that compelling business case they needed, and we're able to then, so my job became to prep them to go present to the Resources Council, and they got the funding. So I felt like that was, probably similar to what you were struggling with before, like setting the tone that I'm not, you may be unhappy with the person who told me to work with you, but I'm here to help you. And ultimately, it's going to help us to be under some of the rigor that the PMO brought with it definitely helped them with over time. But it was that first step that really made them willing, like I say, more willing to work with me and start giving me the information that ultimately we'd need to move the program forward.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I love that example. There's like not that you were using these exact words, but there's maybe this theme in our shared examples of, if you can lead with humility and a form of partnership, right? To your comment, like, everyone in these situations we're describing, we're all facing a common issue. We want this thing to be successful. That's why we're involved. Right? So if humility and partnership can create a focus on the mission, and you're competent, because, right, let's be honest, you can be humble and offering help, but if the person knows you're like actually an idiot, then we're all in trouble.
Right.
But once you have those three pieces, then they're kind of then gradually you can typically get to a place of working successfully together, right? And they're not always going to be like lifelong best friends, and it won't always be easy, but I think those are like such key ingredients, right, to figuring out how you get to a place of alignment, even if individual motivations or needs and expectations are not in the same place.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah, that it does make a little sense. And I said I was taking a right turn, and turns out I really wasn't. It was very similar to one of the situations that you described. So, all right, let's go back and talk about, like, I know you said, and it's not really a playbook. It depends on the situation, the steps you actually take. But, so my early win in the example I gave you was that business case, right? We needed to get some more funding for the next phase.
Yeah.
So when you're starting to work with a new program that's, like, say, quote unquote, not healthy, you're trying to establish momentum. What are some of the early wins examples of early wins that you've sought to accomplish to feel like this program that, I'll use another cliche, off the rails, we're getting back on the rails, you're starting to show some of that success that you were describing, that you need to partner with that other lead to achieve. How do you approach that?
Yeah, great question. So in my experience, it's useful to either focus on, or I find a lot of the examples that come to mind maybe fall into one of two categories.
Okay.
Right. So category A is a variant of the, that classic visual in all varied parts of life, where you have a massive iceberg and you can only see a little bit of it above the water, and then beneath is all this other stuff. So a lot of times when programs or organizations or people are perceived as being underperforming, that's just based on what you see above the water. And so the more we in the examples we're describing can understand what's going on underneath that's driving that perception, which oftentimes, but not always, comes back to a form of storytelling.
Right.
Because the program is unable to articulate in a way that leadership understands either what they're needing or why they're struggling, and there can be more going into it than that, but I feel like 9 times out of 10, a huge component of this misalignment between success and what organizational leadership is looking for is the inability to tell stories about their program and how things are going. So that's a huge piece.
Yeah.
And another, I think, kind of related example, which could include an aspect of communications and storytelling, is like when we were talking about in the first 48 hours or whatever, trying to understand what are the real no kidding issues in the next 30 days and the stuff over the horizon we need to help them resolve. If you can show the team that by understanding their problems, you have the skill set to help them actually solve those problems and get stuff out of the way so they can keep moving, whether they're into you being there or not, so to speak, they oftentimes are kind of like, oh, okay, look, you're like useful. And that can be maybe their biggest issue over the next 30 days is they can't convince, like the example you were using, they can't convince this resource council to give them the funding, and they're going back for their third try. Or they can't get the stakeholders aligned on requirements, or they can't get this test release out of factory test from the vendor before, but whatever that is.
Right.
If there's ways to kind of triage those problems and show that you can lead without authority and bring people together to solve something in a timely manner, that's where you can, I think, start to win the hearts and minds of the people that you're working with, where they see you as a contributor. I feel like the challenge for any of us in these examples, whether you're kind of like you and I coming from the contracting side of things, or you're a brand new program manager, is it takes extra time and energy when you're new to get to understand like their mission, their world, their domain as rapidly as possible. Because like my storytelling example, you can be an amazing communication specialist with a marketing background who can craft the most gorgeous briefings in the history of mankind. But if you don't know enough about the technical content that's relevant to the conversation and you're unable to translate it, you are about as useful as used gum to them in the moment. So
yeah.
So the onus is on us as the new people in those situations to show that we're doing everything we can to understand their world, because we recognize that if we don't understand their problems the same way that they do, then we're not speaking the same language and we're just going to talk past each other, and it's going to be hard to make progress.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense. So if you found, like, I mean, going back to where we started, like, you were talking about two different situations, and I think a lot of them were focusing on, where we're dropped in a program and asked to help. But, like your other one was, you're on a program and you're working, and the new leader shows up, and part of your role, the roles that we typically play on a program is to help them get integrated into the program. And I would imagine similarly, like helping them build the acumen and understand the program in a way is valuable, so that they can start to, because you've already, in that situation, you've already assumedly got credibility. You're trying to help them build credibility. And it's a different flavor of what you described, but just as important for sure. Right.
Yeah. Couldn't agree more. Cause it's, I can't remember who said this. I know it was someone much smarter than me, so it's not an original idea, but this idea that whether you're in more of a kind of a supporting or enabling capacity, like you and I might be, or you're the actual no kidding leader of the team, if at whatever point in the future you leave and things fall apart, were you really very effective?
Right.
Because if success was just because of skill sets that you brought to the moment, and you're not able to create a team that has the capacity and resiliency and processes and what it needs to be successful in the absence of any one person, then you're actually not very effective. You're like a great firefighter, right? But probably not a very strong leader. And I think that, so to your point around enabling the success of others using those kinds of tactics is critical.
Yeah. And I think a lot of time, I mean, we definitely fall into both those categories that you laid out at the beginning, but it is harder. I mean, I don't know. And one side, it's a little easier because you know that your job is to make that person look good and ultimately to be able to run the program without you there in a lot of cases. But the other side, you still got your role maybe on the program, and you got to figure out how to coexist with this person depending on what your role was. But yeah, so I want to hit one more thing before we wrap up and talk about the team and how we approach. I mean, one of the things at Evans we've always talked about is our human-centered approach and how and by that I mean like we have, in this case we're talking about somebody maybe tells you to go work on this program, and then you've got the program manager you're working closely with, but they're running a whole team. And part of our ability, I think, to succeed in that situation is to develop relationships top to bottom in that program organization. And so we've reached the point where it's not like the first couple of weeks or even the first, but you realize like that there's a bigger team, and traveling with those people certainly helps because you develop bonds. But what are some of the other ways that you've worked to like understand more about that team and maybe getting down into the weeds about how communications are working between, say, engineering and like the risk manager or something like that? I don't know, it's a great example, but just understanding like how you approach like understanding the team and how they're communicating and working together to develop one of the things we try to help them develop a better business rhythm.
Yeah. Because that whole people diagnostic piece is really important, because that's what, at the end of the day, like what makes things move, right? People's ability to work successfully together. So I think one useful tactic is, we've talked a lot about a lot of examples that relate to understanding how to determine what's working well, what's not, what needs attention, right? What's urgent versus what's maybe more noise. I think in the moment, if you can understand, oh, this is not going well, once you get through whatever that thing is to the other side of it, so it's more successful, taking the time to go back, and whether through conversation or doing, a short group conversation, you could label it lessons learned, you could call it whatever you wanted, but really let's talk through as a group, like, why was that so challenging? Because none of us want to just live firefighting day in and day out. And if one can try to create an environment, which is way easier said than done, where you have people looking around to understand everywhere all the time, where can we be fixing things? Or as someone you and I both know likes to use a phrase, how do we turn like an event into a process? Because a lot of this stuff can be predictable. Then like, let's perform our work kind of accordingly. So that can, in some instances, really help to understand and build, not just build those relationships, but understand like where people's strengths and weaknesses are, where their challenges, or where is resources not allocated the right way. Because a lot of that does start right at the working level. It's not just at kind of management leadership levels. Another critical piece that I know you're a big believer in is some form of, whether you call it an offsite or some variant of that word, putting people in management and leadership roles that have to work closely together as a group, which isn't always just the people in quote unquote your organization, but putting people in a room for material periods of time on a recurring, predictable basis, so that you can talk about the long-term needs that you have together as a group and how you grow together in your understanding of each other's strengths and weaknesses. Typically that involves a little bit of some topics that focus around leadership development, and a little bit of topics focused around long-term planning, and going deeply into whether it's budget or personnel or some other things that need some resolution. But it's in spending time with people, right? Like, working relationships are like any other relationship. As you spend time with people, it's easier to work with them, and then you grow to trust one another. And in the absence of that, if you just have more of a transactional relationship over email and meetings, it's possible, but it's going to take a whole lot longer to get to that same place.
Yeah. I mean, I 100% agree with you, because it's been some of the most valuable time. And I mentioned, being on the road together helps, that kind of a thing. And just getting to know a little bit more about that person that's not related, that makes it non-transactional, like you said, is super valuable. All right, so we've covered a lot of ground. So from the things you do in the first couple of days versus in the next, within the first couple of weeks, month, et cetera, developing that horizon of 90 days. If you're, so take the persona, we're not consultants anymore. You're a program manager being asked to step into a program, and it's a Monday. What are the first three things you want to get done to make sure you're showing some success by Friday?
Yeah. So to recap a few of the things we've talked about, and not just to recap, but I think we've covered a lot of ground, in other words, that gets to right these kinds of points. One is I am very much a firm believer in, I'll call it an and, of having a 30, 60, 90-day plan, while recognizing that that plan needs to be dynamic, because it's important to get a no kidding, real, plain English understanding of what's going on as quickly as possible.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's where, like, thematically, I think leaders who show up as, I don't want to get in the way and slow things down. I do want to understand the no kidding challenges that you're facing, and I don't want the sugar coated version. And the more you can understand that in a matter of days and not weeks, the more you'll have a real grasp of what's actually going on and what's not. So I think the first thing is focus on, right, giving people the space to have a practical conversation to raise like the real issues that you might hear at the bar or over lunch, but don't show up in PowerPoints. I think the second thing that comes to mind is, as you go through that process, the reason it's important to ask lots of questions is because the lack of bad information doesn't mean that that thing is fine. Like, a lot of times the stuff that comes up that seems to jump out of nowhere, that's suddenly this hair on fire issue that no one's talked about, and you're kind of like, well, when did this become an issue? Like, why is this so, because it's probably a thing that the right people maybe weren't focusing on or paying attention to, because there were other things that actually were on fire that needed your attention. And so, as I think a new leader is understanding the dynamics in their organization and the programmatics and the budget and the people stuff, like, don't reserve enough of your time and attention to focus on the other things that might sound fine, because they might not be fine pretty soon.
Right.
And I think the third thing is, by the time you get to the end of that first week-ish period that we're talking about, the benefit of having all these conversations and focusing on getting to know everyone is that you need to have, I believe, a pretty clear understanding of what's the list that you've come up with that you can validate with whatever your management leadership team looks like, to say, all right, like, based on everyone's input, it sounds like these are the things that I need to focus on to help you all. And it sounds like this one's number one and this one's number two. What do you all think? Okay, sounds awesome. Then, given that, I'm going to work with these people and we'll get this one resolved. And I need you and you on point to work with me on this one. And here's what we're going to do. So if you can get to a point rapidly where you have a practical application of some version of like an action plan, but that ideally is aligned to both what the agency or the organization needs from a mission standpoint, as well as their actual concerns, if there's a way to kind of map those so they can see you like, oh, wow, this person's like super useful. They heard us. I can see why they're reframing that thing in a way that can help us be successful over here. There's an art and a science to that. But I think that's the third piece, right? If you can show, so the underlying theme in that third one is like, show value immediately. Because the more you can do that, then the more they will get that you're a functional, useful human being. And you won't have to direct them as much, because I'm not saying they will want to work for you, but they'll at least believe in your ability to be helpful, which, like we've been talking about, is kind of the necessary starting point.
Yeah. Yeah. And it does show, like you said, that management chain that you've, I mean, well, both to that and the program team, like, you've accomplished something, right? I'm not just meeting with people for meeting's sake. I've got something. Here's my take. It may not be 100% correct. I mean, Shoshana and I talked about, like, but you've got enough information. You've turned some unknowns into knowns, and you're ready to, like, we'll probably do some more validation, but move forward on those things that are on your list. So I think that's
and long term, that's to your exact point. Like, that's what breeds trust from the much higher levels. And as we know, the way things work in government is if senior leadership trusts that you're focused on the right things and you have a good story and you're making progress and you're delivering against expectations, what comes with that is more support and resources, which is what every team wants, especially when they feel like they're struggling, right? So I think the more that the new leader can focus on creating that kind of an alignment, like I can help senior leadership trust that we are now on the right track and they will give us what you've been asking for all along and broker those relationships, then the more successful they'll be.
Awesome. All right, Bob, I think it's taken enough of your time here. That's a great place to land. I once again thank you for doing this. Not surprisingly, enjoyed the conversation with you. We've got some great practical tips that we shared there. And for those of you listening, if you want to go to our website, evansinc.com, to learn more about the work Bob and I and our company does with the federal government, please do. And if you're a federal program manager or somebody like us that's going to help a program manager, pick one of those 3 moves that Bob talked about and try it. So that's Progress Over Perfection. Until next time, talk to you soon.
Thanks.